evening about end-to-end testing in Umbraco with Cypress. So this is probably geared heavily towards what I've been doing in Cypress. So I've obviously been working on vendor, and I've been wanting to test and make sure that that's running how I need it to run. So it's probably geared towards package developers, but it would also be highly relevant to doing unit testing in Umbraco itself. So if you want to help out with the unit testing in Umbraco, end-to-end testing in Umbraco as well, this will be useful, but it'll also be useful for stuff outside of Umbraco. A lot of the concepts will be transferable anyway. But so, hi, I'm Matt Brailsford. You probably know already. It was on the slide before that one. But yeah, so as a package developer, back in the good old days, the approach to kind of making sure that your package was working was just release it and let the users kind of find out what's wrong with it. So you would just package it up, get it out there, and let people use it. And then if anybody complains, then you know it's broken. But nowadays, however, that's not quite, or you can't get away with that. So there's been obviously quite a plethora of pretty high standard packages these days coming out. So things like Marketing Suite, Kevin Jump's USync Pro, and obviously my own vendor package. But it's kind of taking package development to quite a different level of probably what we've seen in particularly my open source kind of package development particularly. So we just can't get away with the same thing. You can't, especially when you're charging money, you can't charge money and then let people be the people that are going to be finding problems in your product. So really, we need to be doing something to kind of to catch those before we deploy and release. So essentially, it's about ensuring quality in the product, and the way that we're going to do that, given that this is an end-to-end testing talk, is around testing. When we're talking testing, there are probably 3 different options as well. So there's unit testing, which happens quite low level. It's usually within the code base, and generally they're a lot faster and a lot leaner, so you can run them whilst you're in mid-development. There's also integration tests, which just take unit tests a little bit further and make sure that components in your code base can work together. But then you've got end-to-end testing, which essentially tests your application from the actual UI all the way through, touching everything that would normally get touched when somebody's using your application. So it's that we're going to talk about today, the end-to-end testing approach. All 3 of those are valid, so it's not a case that you can do one and that's going to cover everything. Ideally, you should be doing all of those, but I'm also of the mindset of something is better than nothing. So I struggle with unit testing and integration testing. It just doesn't seem to click in my head, but end-to-end testing really did. But yeah, so something's better than nothing, but ideally you should be looking at all of those areas. So like I said, from end-to-end testing, essentially what this means is we're going to test our application from the UI. So we're actually going to interact with the application. That's going to then do what the application normally would do, which is probably going to incur database hits and running back-end code. And we're essentially going to use the UI as we would, and then check that UI to make sure that it's as we're expecting as we move along. So that's just what we mean by end-to-end testing. So the tool that we're going to use to do this is called Cypress. And why would you want to use Cypress? So I did do quite a few reasons why you would, but ultimately there's only one, which is everybody else is using it. At the moment, it just seems to be the most popular approach to doing end-to-end testing. You've probably heard of Selenium, which is probably the most popular prior to Cypress, but Cypress has kind of taken a new approach that seems to just work really nicely, and it is easier to get up and running and writing tests that I found anyway. I did play with Selenium a while ago, but Cypress has just been so much easier. And like I say, everybody else is using it, so it must be the best option. So in terms of getting started with Cypress then, I'm going to talk about how I do it with Umbraco, but obviously before we get there, I need to just give you a little bit of background on Cypress itself and how you would use Cypress. So I'll just give you like the raw basics of how you get started. So Cypress is installed as an npm package. So you would do this at the command line. You would go into your project folder and you do an npm install Cypress, and you would save this as a dev dependency in your package.json, which should be familiar to front-end people, maybe not so much in back-endy land, but it's a pretty common approach to installing packages. Just think of it like NuGet packages for front-end people. So you can install Cypress, and then you would run Cypress with an npx cypress open command. Then this would fire up Cypress test runner, and the first time that you run this test runner, it will automatically set up a default folder structure and would dump a load of kind of out-of-the-box tests just so you can run something and see some tests running. And if you were to run those tests, then you would see something like this. So this is essentially the test runner interface, and you can see Cypress actually performing the tests. So if you see on the right hand side that the screen is just like flicking through all the different screens, it's actually performing the interactions, clicking buttons, opening drop downs, clicking on options, and it's doing it a hell of a lot faster than I could possibly do it manually. But then it's also, as you can see on the left hand side, validating that it's doing what you expected it to do. And we can have a look at how we will do those ourselves and be able to write those tests. So in terms of writing your first test then, in the folder structure that is created by Cypress, you get a Cypress folder, and there's a few folders in there, but generally the tests go in an integration folder, and they are usually called like spec files, so it's a specification of a test. So when we're creating new tests, we'll create a new JSON file inside the integration folder, and in there, we create tests in this kind of structure. So it's usually, you define a context. So this test is to do with a certain area of your application. And then you define a test, which is this it, and it's kind of prompting you to say what the test is. So it should do X, Y, and Z. So you can title your tests in that way. So here we're just doing it does not do much, and then you can perform assertions and actions and things within that test, and that will kind of trigger Cypress to run those and run those checks for you. So here's like a really, really simple one. So it's just saying expect true to equal true, which is always going to be the case. And what that would look like in the test runner is this would show up as green. So you can see that that test has passed. And if you were to swap that around so that true equals false, which is clearly not true, then your test runner would display that as a big red box, so you could see how you would see things succeeding and things failing. So you'll be able to see when something isn't what Cypress was expecting or what your test was expecting to happen. So that's like really basic. You define a context, create a test, and in there you're going to run some code to actually perform the actions that you want to do. So within a test, there's quite a lot of different things that you could do, but just some useful commands that you'll probably want to use, or what I've used quite a lot of. You can do setup and teardown, so you can do run code before your entire test suite, or you can do a before each, which will run a piece of code before each test runs itself. We'll use that one, and I'll flesh that out in some of the later tests as we go along. That'll be the dog. So some other things are, we can visit a URL, so we can get it to navigate in our application. So it can go to URLs and actually navigate around our application that we're testing. We can essentially do things like get elements from the page. So we can look elements up by class or ID, and then we can perform actions on those. So like here we're getting a submit button and then we're clicking it, so we're performing that action. You can also check or get an element and then check that it contains some certain text. So you can look things up not just by class but by the content. So we can find things in the DOM that way. We can perform input actions as well. So we can grab a name input field here, and we can get it to type some text into that field, so we can get it to do that interaction, so we don't have to type those things in ourselves. We can do things like selecting options in a select list, and we can get it to submit a form with the grab the form and then cause a submit on it as well. And then there's also, we're going to want to be able to perform validations as well, or assertions. So we want to actually check certain things are in the state that we expect them to be in. So we can do things like get an element on the page, and then we can do an assertion, which is it should be visible. So therefore it must be visible on the screen. So we can do that kind of assertion. We can do other things like checking the length. So maybe we've got a list of things that are being displayed. We can check and ensure that that is the length that we were expecting it to be. So, yeah, that, or we can do other things like checking that an item has a specific class or doesn't have a particular class. So if actions cause things to be selected or unselected, then you can check that that selection class is not there or is there on an element. So they're just like some really basic ones that you're probably going to use quite a lot of, but there are so many more different commands and options that you can use. So by all means, check out the Cypress documentation for all the different ones. They're just quite a few that you can see the certain things that we can do. So we can grab things, we can perform interactions with those elements that are on the page. We can do things with forms, fill things in, and then we can also perform assertions and check that things are what we expect them to be. So you can see there's a picture there of at least some things that we can do and that we'll kind of expand on as we go along. So now that we kind of understand at least a little bit of how Cypress works and how we're going to write tests to do that, then we need to set up Umbraco and get things set up so that we can write some tests and perform those on an Umbraco install. So what we need to do is get an Umbraco website set up and have that running kind of by the side of our Cypress test suite, and then our test suite can actually do the test on that Umbraco install. So the way that I did this, so this is the folder structure again that Cypress creates out of the box. And then what we're going to do is just create a few extra elements. So I created a sandbox folder, which I don't think is in my Cypress folder, it's one level lower. But essentially I just created a sandbox folder, and in there I dumped like all the Umbraco files and set up an Umbraco site to actually run from there. We've got a cypress.json file which has got some settings in, and an environment file that we'll have a look in at a moment. And we also create a command file that's going to help us just easily launch that sandbox site. So essentially what we want to do is we've got a sandbox folder that contains Umbraco, and we've got a script that we can run just to say, right, launch that site, and then I can go run my test suite against it. So the cypress.json file is a series of settings that gets fed to Cypress. Some of the things are thereby out of the box, but some of the key ones that we're going to want to look at here are these things. So we've got a base URL, so that's just going to point to that sandbox site that we're going to spin up before the tests run. We're going to need a username and password, which I'll get to in a moment in terms of how we do that. But obviously, if we're verifying things in the back office, we're going to need to authenticate before we can do that. So we just need a username and password so we can do the login. And I've also got a WW root and a SQL root, which I'll get to a little bit later on as to what I need those for. So next to the cypress.json file is a cypress.env.json file. So this is essentially environment variables that you don't really want to commit to your repository. So in here we can hold kind of private information, which if I was to go back one or up one, you can see in username and password, it just says see the environment one. So we can put stuff in an env JSON file, and if we don't commit that, they just get merged in when you run that install. So it's just a way of not committing private information to your repository. So in there, we've just got the username and password that we're going to use in a moment. And then in our CMD file, the command file, essentially, I've just got this to say, tell IIS Express to launch my sandbox path and put it on the same port every time. So we had a base URL in the Cypress config, so we want to make sure that when we launch our website, it's always going to be on the same port so that we don't have to keep changing our settings. So that's just a convenience thing, just to be able to easily spin up that test website. And if we run that, we will go through and we'll actually fully set up the site into kind of our baseline. So that will probably, for me, that includes making sure that Umbraco is fully installed and set up. So we'll create a user account, we'll log in. I will actually fully install Vendor onto that installation, and I will basically make sure that that's there, and then I can start to run my tests on top of that. There's just one caveat in terms of setup, and that's just to say, really, you want to make sure that you're using SQL Server when you're setting up Umbraco. Whilst it can run on SQL CE, the tests run really quickly, and it can usually be too fast for SQL CE. So just make sure that you've got you're using SQL Server as your database for it. But here, essentially now then, what we've got is we've got a sandbox folder with Umbraco installed and our vendor, our package, our thing that we want to test installed, and we can easily spin that up, and Cypress knows a little bit about how to, where that's located. So that's us, that's the Umbraco bit set up. So now we can move on to kind of writing our tests to be able to do things. Before we get onto writing tests, I think it helps to, or it helped me anyway, coming from, I have done a little bit of unit testing previously before this, and one thing that's always stuck with me is defining a specific test structure. And what I tend to follow is a 3-step process, which the first step to that is to arrange, and that means to set things, set the application up into a state before you can test it. So that might be creating a bunch of fake objects in the database just so that you know they're there, so that when you come to write your test, you're already set up and you can just test that thing that you want to test. So that's the arrangement side of things. Then you're going to perform an action, or you're going to act. So this means you're going to actually perform the interactions that you are putting on the test. So if you're filling in a form, then you will do the actions of filling in that form, and then you're going to assert. So you're going to perform your assertions to make sure that what you did resulted in what you expected to come out of that. So we will arrange things, we will do the act, and then we will assert. So those really stuck with me in terms of unit testing, and they still work really well with end-to-end testing as well. So if you remember, this is what a test would look like from creating our first test. But if we then kind of put that into our 3-step process of how we're going to do our tests, then what we can do is we can use a before each to do some common arrangement. So we will do certain setup that we need to do before every test. Then within our test, we can do potentially some test specific arrangement if we need to do something, set something up specific for that test. We can do our actions, so we can check, perform the action that we want to test, and then we can run our assertions. So this is essentially the blueprint of how I write my end-to-end tests in Cypress. So if I expand on that a little bit and just give you a little bit of pseudocode on what I do in my unit tests, then in my before each, there's generally 3 things that I always want to do. So this is an arrangement, part of the common arrangement. So what I want to do, or I guess just before I'd explain that, one key thing with tests is your test needs to be kind of isolated. So you always need to make sure that one test can run. You could just run one test and it would work. It can't rely on anything before it. So essentially you need to make sure that you're kind of stripping everything back down or getting it into a particular state before every test runs, so that no matter what's happened before, it doesn't play around with this test. They should always be isolated. So what that generally means in terms of my arrangement is I want to strip the database down, get rid of any data that was there prior to this test running, and I want to get it into a state, a common state that I know it's going to be in. So what this means for me is I generally run some SQL statements that are going to clear out my database. It's going to strip out any content that was created by any previous tests and get it into a position that I know it's going to be in. Stripping the database down isn't enough within Umbraco, so there's a lot of caching going on as well. So another thing that I'm going to need to do is to be able to clear all those caches. So get Umbraco to forget anything that it's remembering and just start afresh on the next request. And then equally in Cypress, so not only do I need to do that, but Cypress, when it's running its test, will clear out any of its kind of front-end session as well, which means it will also lose any login credentials from any previous test. So before every test, we're going to need to log in again as well. So we're going to need to make an authentication so that we can perform our tests on the back end. In the test itself then, there's potential that we're going to need to seed some extra test data. So if we're going to test certain actions that rely on some data being there, then as part of that test, we need to set that data up. So that's part of the arrangement within the test. Then we're going to perform our interactions, and then we're just going to assert and make sure that things are, like I say, as we expected them to be. So the first thing then really is looking at these two steps. I'm going to look at these two steps together. So first thing I want to do is clean the database and clear the cache in Umbraco. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to use some custom Cypress tasks. So tasks are plugins, well, yeah, so tasks are a type of plugin within Cypress, and plugins essentially allow you to run, or tasks allow you to run kind of external code to Cypress. Generally, they are Node.js based, but it essentially lets you run something external to Cypress. So to create a plugin, in a plugins folder in the project, there's an index.js file, and in here you've got an exports set up, and in there you can say on task, and then you can define your own custom tasks and get those tasks to do certain elements. I won't show the code here for the two tasks that I've created, but I can show you in a demo a little bit later on, just because there's quite a lot of code in there. But in terms of what my two tasks do, I essentially have a database seeding task, which the job of that task is to read the connection string from the sandbox web.config. So it gets the database connection string. It creates an MS SQL database connection to the database, and then it executes a number of SQL scripts that I've got stored on disk. So I'm using some Node.js code that runs external to Cypress to perform that task for me. So it's essentially, that's just going to strip the database down and clean it up. And then I've got another task, which is clear cache, and this is going to run a API controller that I've created, which essentially is set up to just clear every cache object that I know about in Umbraco. It does some extra funky code in terms of I've put that API controller in a gist online. So my code within the clear cache method actually checks to see if the API controller exists. If it doesn't, it gets it from the gist, copies it into an app code folder to make sure that it's there, and then it always knows that that API controller is going to be there to be able to clear the cache when I need to. So I can show you the code for those later on, but essentially now we've got two tasks defined within Cypress.
Matt,
these run some external code. Yeah?
Matt, I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know whether anyone else has lost Matt's audio.
No,
it's working
fine.
for me.
It's working for me.
Just
It's
you, Andy.
fine for me.
Oh, just me then. It's all right.
So essentially then we've got these two tasks. These run some external code, and that code is to see the database and to clear the caches. So from within Cypress then, the way that we will run these is within our before each, we can use a CY, which is the Cypress kind of root object, and we can say task, and then we can tell it the task that we want to perform. So our seed task actually takes some parameters, so I can tell it which SQL script to run as part of its code. And for the clear cache, it's just a clear cache method action that gets performed. So before every task, those two tasks run. First one's going to clean my database, run the SQL scripts to clear it, and the second one is going to clear the app caches. So the final thing in this shared arrangement that we're going to need to do is perform a login to Umbraco. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use some custom Umbraco commands. So Bjerke, who's on here somewhere. He's been working on writing some Cypress tests. There he is waving. So he's been working on some Cypress tests as well for the Umbraco core, and he's kindly started putting this project together, which is a bunch of commands that are Umbraco specific, that are really quite useful, not only to Umbraco, but to anybody who's testing on top of Umbraco as well. So there's some, to install this, it's on NPM. So you can install this as a dev dependency as well, similar to how you installed Cypress. So that'll install that for us. And then in our project, we have a support folder, and in there is some commands.js. So in there, we can say, right, import the commands from this library, and we can tell it to register all the commands that are there in that project. And what that essentially gives us is, where we've seen previously, we can do cy.something and it'll perform an action. Then you can essentially create your own commands to perform certain tasks and encapsulate potentially quite a lot of logic, which some of them are. So for example, some things that are available in this project are Umbraco section, which will perform a navigation to an Umbraco section so that you don't have to kind of get the elements, click the element, whatever. It's all been nicely encapsulated in there. Umbraco tree item is another really useful one, so that can actually open out and expand a tree path and then click or perform an action on a tree item. Another useful one is Umbraco success notification, so you can run an operation, run a task, and then assert that the success notification is displayed, so you know that that thing occurred successfully. And the most useful one that we're going to need right now is this one, which is Umbraco login. And as you can see here, it's getting the environment variables that were in the cypress.json file that was on disk. So it can take the username and password, and it can perform an Umbraco login for us. So we don't have to kind of go to the front end, type in the field, click submit. It does all of this under the hood for you so that you don't have to. And so that really completes our before each for us. So now we're clearing the database, clearing the cache, and logging into Umbraco, and now we know we're ready to actually run our test. So that is the entire before each, or this is usually the before each, or the baseline for my before eaches before I run all of my tests. So then the next thing really then is to go on to actually performing the tests themselves. So within a test, then we can start to perform certain interactions within Umbraco. So again, as we've seen in the useful stuff from the Umbraco helpers that Bjerke's working on, we can do things like go to a section within the back office. We can expand the tree item and then right click. So if we're going to create a new item in my section, then we can expand the vendor section. We can click on the create menu option, and this will start to then go through that create sequence when we're creating an item in the store. But then on top of that, we can use all of the stuff that comes with Cypress as well. So then we can start to look things up in the DOM. We can look up inputs, and we can say, right, fill in the editor name field and type the text test store. We can find the button, success button, and click that to perform a submit. We can then check, we can look elements up by class or by attributes on the DOM elements, and then we can find certain things within those. So we can go deeper and find more elements, and then we can perform an assertion. So we could do things like make sure that it has the text GBP. So we can do those assertions. So you can see there that we're acting by performing actions. So we're clicking on buttons, filling in text, and then we're doing assertions by checking that things are what we were expecting to do. A nice thing about Cypress, though, is that all of your actions are actually also assertions in themselves. So if it can't find an element, then it would fail the test and it would error. So essentially, simply by looking up an element and clicking on it, that itself is actually an assertion within Cypress as well. So sometimes you don't have to do an explicit assertion to make sure this thing should be visible. Just by you performing the interaction of clicking on it, it's assumed like it has to be visible for that action to happen. So you've kind of done the two things at the same time. So you can kind of balance those up and kind of just use an assertion where it makes sense. As you can see here, we've got quite a lot of potential duplicate code that we're probably going to incur quite a lot throughout the application as well. So it would be quite nice to pull out some of those things that we're going to do again and again and just maybe simplify those. And we can do that then by creating our own custom commands. So how Björk has created the set of commands that are in that project, we can actually create our own and use those as well. So this is the snippet from before, and you can see here we're getting an element which is the editor name field. So quite often, if we're going to be testing creating new items, we're going to keep getting that name field and we're going to be typing something in there. So we're going to be doing that a lot. And then I've also got this command that I use quite a lot, which is to look up a specific property, like a wrapper around a property editor within the UI. So that command is going to happen quite a lot as well. So it'd be quite nice if I could wrap those into my own commands to simplify that process. So the way that you do that is in that commands file where we imported the Umbraco commands, you can actually start to define your own in there as well. So for this, we will do cypress.commands.add. We'll give our command a name, and within that function, we can then perform the action, and it'll perform that action in place of our command. You can do things like pass in variables as well. So here for this Umbraco property, I can pass in the name of the property that I'm wanting to look up, and I can use that within the command itself. But with custom commands like that, we can then kind of narrow or slim that down and make that much more self-explanatory of what that's doing. So, and use the actual commands rather than having these select options all over the place. And it's particularly useful in these types of cases where we're not necessarily in control of that UI. So some of those things could change if the UI changes or the classes or the DOM structure changes. So we've got one place that we can go back to when we can improve, or we can just make that change if it moves, and then we know that all of these tests are going to use that or get updated with that command. The one thing I would say though is you don't want to necessarily wrap everything in custom commands, because if you put everything into commands, then you've essentially created your own API, and it's going to get harder and harder for your dev team to kind of be able to create tests, because they've got to learn your entire language of your custom commands. So you do still want to use the commands out of the box that come with Cypress, but where it makes sense in these sort of scenarios where you're going to be reusing the same thing again and again, then you can wrap those in custom commands. I've just fast forwarded really quickly. Okay. Now, so next is, before I get on to just the demo, there's another key thing that you should learn about, which is taking shortcuts. So one of the key things in Cypress is you want, although you're doing UI testing and end-to-end testing, you don't want to do end-to-end testing for absolutely everything. You need to be able to learn to bypass a lot of your UI and skip ahead where essentially your tests need to test the thing that you want to test. You don't want to be testing all of the setup and all of the arrangement. You need to get the arrangement done prior to running your tests. So you're going to need to be able to take shortcuts to get to that position. So as an example, if we had a test like this, which was can delete a store, then you're going to need to make sure that a store exists before you can test that you can delete the store. So the question is, how do you ensure that the store exists? So you've got a few options. You could say, well, let's rely on a previous test. So if we've got a test that is create a store, then we could simply say, well, just make sure that we run our delete store test after the create store, then we know that the store exists. But as I said a little bit earlier, really your tests need to be self-contained. So you can't rely on the output of another test to affect the test that you're going to run. So we're not going to do that. We can't rely on a previous test. Another thing you could do is just duplicate the whole thing. So where we did the create, if we do a create test, we could run all the operation as well. Again, open the context menu, right-click create, and then fill it in and click save button. But that's a huge waste, because that's going to slow down your tests, and really you shouldn't be using your UI to do setup. You should only be using your UI to test the thing that you're actually looking to test. So we can't do that either. So the key really is that you need to be able to seed your data via the API. I could actually seed my data using the SQL scripts thing that I've done before, but this is another good technique that you really want to be able to learn as well, which is being able to just bypass your UI and work directly with like the API controllers to pre-populate something directly. So an example of how that might look for me in Vendor is something like this. So we're going to use a feature in Cypress called fixtures. And fixtures essentially are just JSON files on disk that it will load into, it will load off the disk and give you as a JSON object. And then you can use that in a request or as the post data to a request. So essentially a fixture is going to be a fleshed out store object, test store object with all the settings that we know that our save store API controller accepts. But we've just got it predefined on disk. We'll load it into memory and we'll send it to the save store that can perform a save operation for us. And this is exactly what we're doing here then. So we'll load that fixture, the test store object, and we'll say, right, run this custom command that I've got, which is it, Umbraco API request, tell it the URL of the API controller and pass it that data. And so that's going to run the API controller that our UI would normally run. So our UI, when we're creating a store, you'll click create, you'll fill that in, and when you press submit, it will actually send to that API endpoint. But essentially, what we're doing is we're bypassing the whole UI and we're just giving it a JSON object of what something would look like anyway. So here, we've completely bypassed that, and this is the thing of taking shortcuts. So as I say, my test store fixture is essentially this. It's just a JSON representation of the store object that would get posted and saved. And so what that means then is I can now do a bunch of setup using Umbraco's APIs and make sure things are in a state that I need them to be, and then I can actually run the tests and test the thing that I want to test. So that's kind of a lot of information. I hope all of that made sense, but we can start to piece this all together now. And so I can actually show you some of this in action. If anybody's got any questions before I kind of spin up my example, then feel free to ask, or if anything didn't make particular sense. But let's see. Yeah, okay. So here then is, let me just close this, is my project. And as you can see, this is the Cypress folder. In there, we've got the folder structure from before. I've got a sandbox folder. I was right that that doesn't actually sit under Cypress, but here you can see the sandbox folder. This is containing all of my Umbraco website project. We've got our command file, which is just running IS-Express, and essentially when that runs, it just spins up our website in IS-Express for us and make sure that it's running on the right port that Cypress is expecting. And then in the integration folder, then this is where I've got my tests for my project. So I've kind of created subfolders, so you can do that. You can organize the specifications and your tests into logical groups. So in vendor, we've got a settings section, we've got a commerce section. So I've just grouped my test into that same logical grouping, which makes sense for me. But if we look in here then, so settings store, I've created some CRUD operation tests for store-based operations. And in here then, we've just got a series of tests. So we've got it can create a store, it can delete a store via the tree context menu, it can delete a store via action menu. So we're going to like test certain aspects of our user interface. As you can see here, what I had in my original, which is this before each, we're going to clean the database, clear the cache, and we're going to perform an Umbraco login. But then in this create store, then we can perform quite a few different operations. I didn't run through this one earlier, but you can essentially tell Cypress that you're expecting a certain URL to be called. So you can essentially tell it to monitor this and expect that to be run And then we can later on say, well, wait till that thing occurs, so we can run certain tests that way. But here you can see we are going to the Umbraco settings section. We're going to find, we're going to make sure that the commerce route is visible, which might help to kind of show what this is actually looking at. So this is going to test in settings. It's going to create a store. So it's going to right click on stores. So it's got to come to the settings section. It's going to click on this stores node. It's going to create, and it's going to run that user interface for us. So this is the navigating to the settings section. Then we just make sure that our tree is loaded. Then we're going to use the commands from the Umbraco Help Us by Baker that's going to expand the tree and go to vendor stores tree. And it's going to right click, and from the Umbraco context menu, it's going to click on the create action. Then we're going to type into the name field. One of the tests I'm doing here is making sure that the alias that gets created from Umbraco is what I expect that to be. So we wait for that in the UI. If in Umbraco, when you fill in the name, a request gets made to go generate the alias for that page. So then we can check and make sure that the alias comes back as what we expect. And then we can run a submit button. And in vendor, when you create a store, it essentially creates a complete setup. So it creates a bunch of order statuses, countries, currencies, all those sorts of things. So as part of this create test, I can actually make sure that all of those things occurred. So I can make sure that if I go into a store, that I can make sure that all of these options, these tree items below, are visible. I can also make sure that these things are all visible and that they contain the items that should have got created when the store was created. And it's just doing them all for me. So I can set these up, and then it's just going to run and be able to do all of that. And it just means when I need to test or a new version of Umbraco comes out, I can run all of these tests, and I don't have to do all these things manually like I kind of trying to be doing before. But inevitably, all you end up doing without tests is just clicking around and kind of seeing if anything is broken or looks broken. But with these end-to-end tests, I can run the same thing again and again and again and make sure that they keep working. So yeah, essentially I'm just running a bunch of assertions to make sure that certain things exist. In the delete dialog, like I said, or showed on the slides previously, before I can delete something, I need to make sure that a store exists. So I create a store, and then I go perform the actions, go to the settings section, right click on a store, in the, right click, choose the delete action from the context menu, click OK, and make sure that that ran, and that the item actually gets deleted, so it disappears from the tree. So you're performing those actions and you're performing all the assertions. In terms of that running then, so if we would take a look, so this is our store CRUD specs. So this is essentially what runs every time that I want to run those specifications. So this is testing that it can create a store. So you can see it clicks on the store, right clicks create, types in the name, submits, and then validates that all of these things underneath exist. So that to me is a lifesaver because I don't have to do that every time. It's just going to do that in an automated way. We've got two different ways of deleting. So you can delete via the context menu, so it checks that works. You can go to an entity, and in the action menu in the top right corner, you can delete from there, so you can check that that works. And that's also set up to do a redirect, so I can check that that does what it needs to do. And I can essentially do that for, well, so far I've got quite a few of the settings objects set up. I also have a few specs that will validate that vendor installed as I expected it to do. So when you install vendor, some new sections get created, and when you create when you install vendor, it creates the settings section, but then if you give permissions to commerce section that gets defined, I make sure that it gets added to the menu and that it's in the right location on the tree. So if it gets moved around between kind of Umbraco versions, then I know something's broken there as well. So yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff there. I think I've got like 28 different tests at the moment, and it's pretty cool that you just got them all, and I can just click one button and it's just going to go through my entire settings and my UI. So where we're saying that it shouldn't be the responsibility of users, I can now have something that gives me a level of certainty that things work. It's actually, just by writing these end-to-end tests as well, it has highlighted a few bugs that were there. So it's helped me identify a few bugs that I didn't know were there, and I was able to fix them by writing these tests. And we've also had a couple of bugs that were raised on the issue tracker, so I was able to write some end-to-end tests to validate that that thing has been fixed. And then I know as well, moving forward, that those will be fixed, or should always be fixed in the future as well. So hopefully I don't get any regression tests on that as either. But yeah, so let's have a look. So I've showed you really quickly what Cypress does, how you could set up Umbraco next to that, and then how you can write some tests that would interact with Umbraco specific UI, how you can create custom commands, how you can create custom tasks, which should all be pretty useful. There's a ton of stuff still that you could learn from Cypress. There's some really cool stuff that I want to learn about as well. I started, but I haven't got it working properly yet. So all of these are essentially what you call functional tests. So it checks that the function works, but you can also do visual testing with Cypress, which I think is really quite cool and interesting, which is you can get it to take screenshots of like certain elements or certain controls, and then you can compare those with a baseline of a screenshot. So if you run your tests, create a load of baseline screenshots, then you can say, well, when Umbraco 8.9 comes out, you can install vendor, run vendor, and then you can validate that the screenshots, when you create them again in this test suite, that they haven't changed significantly from the baseline screenshots, which is really quite useful because you're not in control of like the DOM or the CSS, which I know a lot of things have been changed recently for the accessibility stuff, which is cool, but it just means I've got to be aware and be careful that those could break my UI. So it'd been, functional tests won't give me that, but visual ones would. So I'm quite interested in looking into that and getting that working as well. But there's a whole heap of stuff that you can do with Cypress, and it's once I got that structure set up and that before each, once that was all in place, it's been really quite simple to get like new tests done. So it's like if I've got a spare hour, I can now just say, okay, well, I'm just going to write all the tests for another area, and the blueprint, it's just a blueprint of, right, do the assertion, do the arrange, do the act, do the assertions, and it's quite nice. It's quite a nice process to be able to set those tests up. So useful resources, obviously Cypress website, cypress.io. The Umbraco themselves have got a bunch of end-to-end tests that they're trying to set up for the project, which came out of the Unicore project, but it's still they're still usable on the current install of Umbraco as well. So you should really go have a look at that. And if you want to have a go at writing some unit tests specifically for Umbraco, I'm sure they'd really appreciate any help on setting up more tests and testing behavior in Umbraco itself. There's the test helpers from Bjerke. So if you do some unit testing specific to Umbraco and you've got some useful commands that might be useful for other people, then by all means contribute them back to that so other people can take advantage as well. And then if you want to see the end-to-end tests that I've written, and I haven't shared the code for the custom tasks, but I can show you that if people want to see it. But if not, you can get it on my Git repository. So this is at Vendor Hub, and that was that. How long was that? 45 minutes?
Yeah, a bit more, about 50 minutes.
That's all right.
Yeah, that was cool. That was really good. Has anybody got any questions?
I've got
Maybe
one.
it's, yeah, you're first.
Okay, cool. So Matt, I saw like so when you were running through the test and it was obviously doing, performing the actions. I saw in a couple of places you had like Cypress.wait or whatever. How does it know? Because a lot of them, the code looked like, so for instance, when you right click on a menu, sometimes like it takes a minute for it to load. I didn't see anything that said, hey, you expect to see this part of the menu, or that like to know when something's actually happened, because a lot of it's Ajax and stuff.
Well, that's one of the really nice things in Cypress, actually. So all of the commands have got a built-in timeout. So because it runs in the browser, it expects that things are potentially going to take a little while. So Cypress is pre-built to actually wait and just keep testing for a little bit in a loop and wait for something to appear. And if it doesn't appear or doesn't happen within a certain time frame, then it will fail. But for the most part, it will just wait to see if that thing happens or appears, and then the test will continue. So it's really nice that that's all baked in, that you don't have to do a lot of waiting, which I think you used to have to do in Selenium, but you don't so much here. I mean, the only reason I've got to wait here is because I'm waiting for a specific URL that I want to monitor. But if I didn't want to do that, then I wouldn't need to do that wait. It's pretty much baked into all of the actions themselves.
That's really cool. Yeah, because it just didn't make sense, because it kind of looked like it was waiting on stuff, but yeah. That's pretty sweet.
Pretty cool.
Awesome.
You just mentioned Selenium. I had a quick question of just sort of comparing and contrasting the two. Really, have we done much between the two? Because I've used Selenium a long time ago, not recently.
Nor have I recently. The different beasts, really, because I think Selenium it's headless, so it's trying to emulate essentially a browser, whereas Cypress embraces the browser, so it knows it's going to be for end-to-end testing web applications. So you might as well do it in the web, in the browser itself. But really, that gives you a ton of extra things that you can do in Cypress that you can't in Selenium. So just this thing of not waiting, because it knows it's going to be a browser application, it knows things are going to wait, so it automatically does the waiting for you. You can so easily hijack and intercept network requests. So you can fake objects being passed back on the request. And you can, what I was doing in terms of bypassing the UI and actually triggering the API controllers, faking pure requests. You can do that because you're in a browser environment, whereas Selenium, they would have to fake that. So for web applications, I think Cypress is just, I think this is why it's become so popular so fast, because it just works really nicely for web apps.
Yeah, I mean, I used to always struggle with the syntax for writing tests in Selenium, and that was the thing that always, I'd scratch my head. But this is just JS, really.
It is really clean, and I've done a lot of work in terms of stuff that gets duplicated, putting it into commands. So it reads really logically when you're going through the tests, so you know exactly what it's doing.
Yeah, just come back in 6 months' time and you can look at it and still understand what your test is trying to do.
Exactly, and so a lot of this stuff comes from, I think it's Mocha, which is a JavaScript testing structure, but it's like BDD. So you're defining the context, but then I find these descriptive terms really helpful as well. So it's like, it can do X, Y, and Z. It's like prompting you to write a test name that is descriptive of the action that you're going to test. So it's quite cool, and it's just, I mean, me being, well, JavaScript is very C# similar, but I bridge between backend and front end, and just JavaScript is really quite natural to me anyway. I haven't done TypeScript on this, but you can do TypeScript based setup as well. So if you prefer it all strongly typed, but I've always been I like the freedom of doing whatever you want to do with just normal JavaScript. But if you want the TypeScript stuff and strongly typed, you can do that as well, which I know the Umbraco project one does. So
does it have the same browser support that Selenium does? Like,
they've got quite a few now. It used to be that it was only Chrome, but I'm pretty sure they just launched, was it Firefox support today? but I
Yeah,
know they
there's
can do,
Firefox and Edge and so on. So.
yeah.
Okay.
So they can test in quite a few. So actually,
Not Safari though.
not yeah.
Safari. Ah, that's a pain. Because we have with one particular client that I'm with right now, I think about 60% of our traffic is Safari. I don't know why. It's just a weird anomaly that it's just really high in Safari.
Right.
So.
Well, I don't know whether it's been worked on. We'd have to have a look. But yeah, in my test runner there, you can see you can choose the different browser that you want to test in.
Okay.
So by default it's Chrome, but yeah, in there is Firefox and Edge. But yeah, I guess not Safari at the moment.
Yeah, wait and see. Might
Yeah.
happen. Cheers, Matt.
Yep. Matt, I've got another one. So at the beginning, you said about setting it up on like standard SQL rather than CE, and you said it was that SQL CE was too fast. What did you mean by that?
I mean the tests run too quick for SQL CE, so SQL CE can't keep up. Like SQL CE is like really quite minimal, and it just can't handle the like if you like when you see.
Oh no, I'm with you now. I think I misunderstood the way that you. Yeah. So basically, just knack SQL CE.
Yeah. So when you saw the test running, and it's basically running like superhuman, like clicking through the application. SQL CE just can't keep up, but SQL Server's like much better at handling it.
Oh, cool. Can you throttle it then from that sort of point of view as well?
I don't know.
Just okay, cool.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
So I have lots of questions. Is that okay, Matt?
Yeah.
So I used to do, as part of my job about 5-6 years ago, quite a lot of Selenium. So I've got loads of experience of it. I've done about 4 or 5 apps using it. So yeah, it looks really interesting. I've not had time to have a look at Cypress, but yes, it looks really cool. The first question is around, have you got this working in a CI/CD kind of environment yet?
I haven't, but that's pretty much because I just like to run them locally, like before I do a release. But it does support CI setups. I mean, actually, if I end this, so I was running the UI version, but let me just double check what the command is. Yeah, so you can run it in a headless or like a command line way. So npm run test, and then you can actually run that in a CI CD setup. So you can run it as part of your continuous deployment or delivery setup. So this will fire off in here, and you'll start to see the tests and output in the command line rather than through a UI.
Yeah.
If I can give some input here.
Yeah.
Also, I really like the CI/CD setup, because if any test fails, you can set up Cypress to record a video and store that video of the failure.
Yeah.
So basically, you see the same as if you use the UI.
Yeah, cool. That's really nice. How many times do you get false negatives coming out?
Very rarely. I'm just trying to think what were the reason. The only reason that the time that I did was because I did need a wait because I was doing something custom. But not other than that, never. But false negatives potentially tell you that there's something wrong, because the only time it's really going to happen is if something wasn't there that you expected to be there. So by it failing, it's actually telling you that something's wrong with your expectation. Either the application intermittently takes longer, in which case that's a bug that needs fixing, or you've got unreal expectations and that you should be waiting a little bit longer. So maybe those timeouts for expecting something to be visible need to be extended. So even the false negative, it told me something about the application. So it was something that needed to be resolved anyway.
Yeah, because that was always the problem with Selenium, was it would just keel over at a certain test when you were doing your CD, your CI stuff, and you'd have to go in and have a look at it or look at the video, and it was just, eventually it got so annoying that you stopped testing because
Yeah.
it was always failing on one thing, especially if you've got 200, 300 tests.
Once I've fixed that thing, like I've never had it fail. Like it doesn't. I've never seen it fail yet.
We see it sometimes on the Umbraco database or Umbraco code base, but since Cypress 5, they support retries, so you can set up global retries.
Yeah, cool. Have you done any parallelism on it?
I've not. I don't know if Björk has.
Nope.
No.
Because I was looking at when you had the information up on the on the Umbraco the GitHub repository, you mentioned using SQLDB to set that up. So instead of using SQL Server, use SQLDB to do it, and that's one of the ways that I've done that before, is to set up a version of it so you can set up, because it's a lot easier to script those things rather than using an SQL Server instance there, and have that running in parallel, so you can run 4 or 5 tests at once, which is quite cool. One of the things that we had set up as well, which was really, really nice, was is a thing called Cucumber. And I just had a brief look to see if you could integrate it in. So there's this thing called SpecFlow where you're able to basically hook in Cucumber acceptance test, where you could so you could hook in a given this, then given this and that, when this happens, then do this, and convert that into an actual test underneath, using a thing called page objects. Have you come across those?
No, I've not.
So page objects might help you a little bit. So if you look at your code that you had, so there was a page where you had lots and lots of selectors on there, basically. Yeah, so what I would do in this case is use a page object to define what all of those things are, to make it easier to manage. I mean, you don't use them all the time, because then you just replicate the UI in the code, and it makes it easy to difficult to understand. But it could help in making this a little bit more maintainable, especially if you're using this in separate sort of bits. Yeah.
I mean, this isn't unmaintainable to me, really, in terms of like I say, I've grouped what's common. So the thing of getting an Umbraco property I put that into a custom command, and then things like finding a select option or the selected select option, I could probably make that into another custom command. So it depends how far you want to go.
As always, it depends on that.
Yeah.
But that's one of the tools that we use to make things a little bit more more manageable. And the final thing that we did, which is actually one of the coolest things we did, was when we had this set up and linked into Cucumber. So we had groups of unit tests with groups of acceptance tests that were set up, and then on the underneath acceptance tests, we could see what was going to happen. That defines the what the application is meant to do, and the entire framework of the application is we slowed down Selenium so we could record videos of it happening, and then we used that as part of our training documentation.
Yeah. There are some cool things in Cypress. So like Björk says, you can, like I've turned videos off, but you can turn that on, and it can record the processes. But you can actually get Cypress to take screenshots, and you can do some cool things about selecting an element, adjusting the crop. So I know some people are using Cypress to generate screenshots for documentation. So when Umbraco changes, or when the application changes and the UI gets tweaked, you can get it to keep updating the screenshots for the documentation as well. So it's pretty. You can do some things with it as well outside of testing, which is pretty neat. But this can generate videos you generally get a video folder in the root when it's run, but it records essentially what you were seeing in the UI. So when I run those unit tests, it essentially shows you the browser as it was going along.
Eventually, I do really like this. I think this is really cool, especially watching everything kind of to be able to see. It's a little bit hypnotic, really, isn't it? I'm sure you sit there.
I mean, this is probably why I still use the UI, just because I like to see it going through it all, because it's like, that stuff I didn't have to do because it's doing it for me. But there is some cool stuff in this as well. So like when you run these tests, so we'll see when this runs in a minute, just let that go through and run those tests. But like you can see everything that's going on. So when it records a video, it essentially records this bit on the right hand side. So then you can have that. Well, I think, does it record the whole thing? I can't remember if it's the whole or just that. Yeah. So you get a video of this whole thing then, and that gets stored, so you can reuse that. But oh yeah, you can stop this. So if we then go into one of our tests, it actually takes snapshots of the whole process. So you can actually see what Cypress saw at any given moment. So you can actually see what it's doing. So when it's right clicking on a context menu, you can see that operation and that action. And you can go back through that history of things that it's done. And it's pretty cool that you can like go into those and like check that it is what it's meant to be.
You can also click elements on the left side there and then open the console, and it logs out a bunch of extra information about it.
Oh, cool. Which elements?
So for example, yeah, this one I think should work. So if you just open the console, or like when you're waiting for the route, stuff like that, then yeah, it's gonna do stuff like that. And if it's when you're, for example, getting an element, it's gonna show you how many matches there are and what classes and stuff like that.
Neat.
Yeah, I think it's really cool, but the whole thing of having having the front end attached to the back end and having both things tested at the same time, it feels a little bit, I don't know, it is really cool, don't get me wrong, and I think it's very, very, very interesting to see all that happen, but maybe having like a mocked API on the back of it and running these end-to-end tests based on a mock API that sits behind it, and then having a testing the API instead on the other side, so that you can have like fully integration tests from the API interface.
I mean, you can totally do that if you want. So you can intercept the API requests and feed it back an alternative model. So if you've got it all saved on disk, you could write something to say, well, just bypass the whole backend completely and just test the UI. But like I said at the beginning, really, this is not a replacement for other testing frameworks. You should still potentially be unit testing. Like I say, for me, unit testing just doesn't click. So a good example with Cypress not replacing unit testing is it comes really late in the game. Like you're going to have to write Cypress tests after you've built the entire thing and got the UI in place. Whereas a unit test will be able to tell you when something's broken at the point of coding, like that small element. Whereas with end-to-end testing, you have to basically build the UI, the database, everything in between before you can get to test it. So that's the reason why you wouldn't use end-to-end testing to test everything. But then my original statement still holds true, which is any testing is better than no testing. And particularly from a customer perspective, they're going to be finding errors and reporting errors from your UI. So it could be that something isn't unit tested, but if your UI is tested, then I think that's more likely to find something that's going to be a problem for a customer than potentially kind of unit testing. But it's, like I say, it's a complete suite. Really, you should be having parts of both, really. Yeah, no, it is really cool. The conclusion that well, I kind of came to at the end was it was taking up a little bit too much time in the development process, and it was what for Selenium.
For for Selenium up to a point, but I really like the idea of having the way to integrate, to intercept the connections as they come through, to create that mocked API layer underneath. That would be very, very cool to be able to do that, because that was always my difficulty with Selenium. Was it was a kind of a black box that you couldn't really get into. Yeah.
I mean, it's each to the whatever clicks with each person, really. But like I said, for me, it's really quite nice because I can just come through now and just say, right, I've got a spare hour. I'm just gonna write all the tests, and because they're self-contained, you're testing one thing, and you know exactly what the UI should do. It's quite methodical that you're just like, okay, well, what would I do as a user? And then you know exactly what your test is going to do because your test has got to do the same thing that the user was going to do. So to me, it's just really quite logical in my head, and it's just a quite therapeutic process of just going through saying, okay, well, now Selenium, you go click, oh, Cypress, you click that button, you type that text, you expect this to be there. And it's quite clean, quite self-contained, and like when you've got a spare 5-10 minutes, you can just knock another test out.
Has anybody created any? Is there any browser extensions for it yet to record the test for you? Because I know there was a lot around for Selenium for doing that.
Yeah, I think there's one baked in, so you can do recording if you want to do.
So just record it and then it pushes it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And record your runs. So,
but having that mocked side at the back end of it will lead to much greater parallelism and much more false negatives. Although you say there's not that many coming out, but allow you to run it a lot quicker, which is depends on the complexity of your API, I think.
Yeah.
Because if you've got Postman or something set up where you can run your actual API mocked API tests on the other side, it'll get a lot quicker, I think. So yeah, but it's really cool. Thank you very much, Matt. That was really good. Sorry, anybody else got any questions that I've interrogated poor Matt now for the last 20 minutes?
I've got a top tip. Don't share your emails when you're being recorded.
I have a question, but I don't know if it's relevant for all of you. But Matt, you are doing the what's called get save alias where you wait for this.
Yeah.
And in my package we have one element or one custom command called Umbraco editor header name.
Yeah.
Which also does that. Do you find any issues with that, or why are you using?
No.
Why are you explicitly waiting?
Mostly because I probably didn't find it.
Okay. So just due to bad documentation.
Yeah. So because I think I ended up duplicating something in like one of my tests as well. So I've got an Umbraco tree item which doesn't expand the tree; it just looks to see if one's there in a visible tree right now. So I've got that one which is mine, but I've also got yours which I've renamed to Umbraco tree item by path, so that will then get a path. So I didn't. Yeah, it's probably my fault for not looking through the commands, all of the commands that were there in the one that you've been working on. But yeah, I think there's a couple of potential comments that I would say on some of the things in that project. Though is I don't know what the best practice is in terms of like a command performing the action. Some things I think is okay with, like Umbraco's section, where it actually navigates you to that section.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether that should be fetching the section element.
I agree. But now it's harder now to change. But that is also one of the reasons it's still on my GitHub account and not on the organization of Umbraco. But because when we do that, we should align things like that, and we should use real versioning instead of just increment the beta number. There's a lot of things that we will need to invest more time in it, at least.
What did I do for tree item? Because I was trying to piece them together. Oh yeah. So I had like this Umbraco tree item, which just essentially gets the tree item by like element name. But then I had an expander that could be added onto that to be able to like click the expander triangle. So I don't know what's a better approach in terms of giving access to all of the elements if you need them, or kind of having a command that does quite a few things. So that might be something interesting to discuss.
I agree.
But that comes from playing around and trying them out anyway, so we can learn from what each of us are doing with it and make that better.
So Matt, actually, I just in the code there, I've got another question. So I just saw the cross-site request forgery token thing. So does Cypress sort of handle just all of the like cookies and everything automatically, or is there extra stuff that you've got to do for it?
Normally, but this is Umbraco specific. So Umbraco, when you authenticate, sets a cookie, and so its API controllers are automatically like authenticated or protected. So therefore, it needs the cookie to be passed along. So this is just making sure that the Umbraco cookie gets added to the request, so that it's an authenticated request.
Cool. So are these extra methods that you've written, or are these the ones that are part of the extra project that Björka's doing that you said?
All these ones here are ones I've written, which I have suggested this one already to Björka, but anything else I've got in here can, like, if it's useful, then yeah, by all means, these can go back into the project. I basically wrote all of the, because I didn't have any of these like till a few days ago, and then I was just going through the code base, and when I got to the slide of writing custom commands, I thought this was a good example. So I went through all of the stuff that I was duplicating and moved it into commands. So
okay.